Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I want to share a little bit about our Thanksgiving road trip. I have a work in progress. I want to tell you about a book that I'm looking at currently. And I want to talk a little bit more about the sock heel experiment that I introduced you guys to last week. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me in my Ravelry group. It was posted by Christopher. And I thank you very much, Christopher. It's a link to an article on textileartist.org about an artist, a crochet artist named Katika. And the name of the article is Katika Painterly Crochet. So I'm going to put a picture, one of the pictures that they had in this article on there. There are many, many pictures of Katika's crochet work. They really do, from a distance, look like paintings. They're really interesting. And I thought you guys might be interested in seeing more of Katika's work. I will leave a link down below to the article on textileartist.org, as well as to Katika's Instagram account and webpage as well. So, this next tidbit came to me by way of my Twitter feed in a kind of a roundabout way. And it's about Dana Bickford, who invented a circular sock machine for home knitters back in just after the middle of the 19th century. So many of you probably know this, but a lot of you may not, that the Industrial Revolution was it was the textile industry that started the Industrial Revolution. People needed clothes. Every individual person needed clothing, and it all had to be made by hand. So the Industrial Revolution was a way to mechanize textile production that could speed things up and make production much faster and ultimately less expensive. So the first piece of that puzzle, it was the stocking frame that was invented by William Lee back in 1589. And I think it was Queen Elizabeth I who was in power at the time. And she did not like the idea of that stocking frame because she felt that it would reduce income for poor people who did hand knitting as part of their income. So he took it to France, and there was a whole thing. But it took a while for the knitting frame to kind of take off and be used. But over time, other innovations in the textile industry helped to really create the birth of the Industrial Revolution. So there were innovations in looms, where a really wide loom that previously had needed two weavers to operate because you'd have to have one shoving the shuttle from one edge and the other person catching it. They came up with the flying shuttle, which allowed one weaver to manage a wide loom. So that cut down on the number of weavers needed per loom, but the bottleneck was still spinning. You still had hand spinners who were producing the yarn instead of having 5 spinners needed to produce yarn for each weaver. You would need 10 spinners because you'd cut down the number of weavers per loom. So the next step then was creating spinning machines. So there was the spinning jenny and the water frame, and then the spinning mule came into play. And spinning mules are still used today in some mills to produce woolen spun yarn. So all of these innovations built on each other. So the original stocking frame was created flat knitting. So you could create a stocking and you could shape it on the frame, but it would need to be seamed up. So it would take some time for a circular sock machine or a circular knitting machine to be developed. And eventually that was something that home knitters could have. There were these crank style machines, their circular sock machine, but at the beginning they only went in one direction. So you could create tubes, but you couldn't create heels and toes in them. Those had to be done by hand afterwards. Well, eventually, the technology to allow the circular sock machine to be cranked in either direction so that you could knit back and forth, and which meant you could create a sock heel like a short row heel or a short row toe, that innovation came about. And one of the people who created a sock machine that could do that was a man named Dana Bickford. So he had, it was considered a higher end machine because it could do a lot more. It could create all kinds of different stitch patterns. But one of the things that he advertised was that it could be used to knit flat items. And then he had created this technique where you could join two flat pieces together. Well, there's a seaming method. It's to create a flat seam that's called the Bickford seam. And it was about a year or so ago when I was trying to research the origins of the Bickford seam, like where that label came from, that I came across the manual or a copy of one of the machines that Dana Bickford made. And I thought, oh, this is where it's going to be. I'm going to find the method for joining these flat pieces in this little manual. And instead what I found was instructions for how to join these flat pieces while you were using the knitting machine. So you would knit a flat piece first, and then as you were knitting the second piece that you wanted to have joined to the first piece, you would be joining it one row at a time, one selvage stitch at a time. You'd put a selvage stitch from the finished piece on the last knitting needle that was currently in play on the machine, and you could knit the thing together as you were knitting the second piece. So I still don't know where the label Bickford came from for the Bickford seam. I suspect that it is a method of creating a seam that's similar to what you would have gotten with that Bickford knitting machine, with that it's very flat, and that there was just an understanding of kind of what was going on structurally, but using a completely separate piece of yarn to hand seam two flat edges together. That's what I suspect, but I really don't know. However, there was a bit of scandal in Dana Bickford's company, which was that his company had been around for 10 years. It was doing really well. His machines were really popular. Other companies were making circular sock machines as well. And he came out with a machine with several innovations in it. But apparently, he stole those innovations from two other inventors who had patented those techniques. And they sued him, and he was ordered to remove the use of those pieces of technology from his machines going forward. So it was sort of the beginning of the end for Dana Bickford's company. But the town where his machines were manufactured, and the factory was in Brattleboro, is the name of the town, and the newspaper there had an article about that Bickford knitting machine and the factory that produced those machines, and talks a little bit about Dana Bickford's problems with his circular sock machine innovation. So I'm going to leave a link to that article down below, but I'll also leave a link to the Bickford Family Knitting Machine manual in case you're interested in reading through it and seeing what this looked like, because I find it really interesting. And if you know where the label Bickford seam came from for this flat seam, this method of seaming something flat, I would love to know more about it, because I have looked in as many vintage and antique knitting manuals as I can find, and I just can't find it mentioned anywhere. I just assume that it's something that must have come out of the 19th century, because it would have had to have been during the time period when Bickford would have been a household name in terms of his sock machine, or his knitting machine. So if anybody knows, please let me know down in the comments. Sometime in the past, I don't know, week or two, time is a blur because of Thanksgiving, somebody asked in my Ravelry group about how to turn a lace pattern upside down, how to knit it in the opposite direction. She found a pattern that she really liked, that was a lace pattern that the instructions are to knit it in this direction, bottom up, because it's a very directional lace pattern, and she wants to incorporate it into a sweater that she's planning on knitting top down, and she wanted to know how to convert this pattern. And the thing is, there is no like, here's how you do it. There are ways to, here's how you start, and then here's what you need to do to examine it, and then here's the point where you start to experiment and do swatching and decide if that result is a good enough replication of the original thing that you want to knit, because in particular lace can be tricky to turn upside down, and that's because of the directional issue of decreases, and because the opposite of a decrease is an increase only in terms of the number of stitches that you're creating or eliminating, but the specific look of a decrease is not the same as an increase. So that can be a tricky thing, but somebody mentioned in that discussion thread that there was a book that was written by Wendy Bernard, author of the Custom Knit series, called Up, Down, All Around Stitch Dictionary. And so because we have a wonderful textile center here in the Twin Cities, and regardless of what guild you belong to, all of the books are housed in the same library, and as long as you're a member of one of the guilds or of the textile center, you can check out any book. Well, our Knitters Guild is always buying new books. And so they had that book on hand called Up, Down, All Around. So I wasn't really sure what it was, and I couldn't really tell from looking at the description. But basically, it's 150 stitch patterns that take the work out of having to do any sort of conversion. So a lot of stitch dictionaries, particularly older ones, will have written instructions only, and they will assume that you're going to be knitting flat. And so in order to convert them to knitting in the round, you need to do some conversion. And the other thing about flat knitting is that often there are extra stitches that are added to however many stitches are in the multiple. So let's say you had a multiple of 12 stitches. If you were going to be knitting it flat, you'd pick your multiple of 12, 24, 36, whatever, and then you might have to, and then you would add those extra stitches. Might be one stitch, it might be as many as 11. And those extra stitches are going to create a symmetry when you are knitting that pattern flat. But when you're knitting in the round, in most cases, you won't need those extra stitches. Once in a while, there'll be one extra stitch, and it might be needed regardless of whether you're knitting flat or in the round. It's not very common, but that's often the case. The simplest thing for someone like me is to just chart out the pattern, and then that chart will work whether I'm working flat or in the round or whatever. But not everybody has the skill to do that or the desire to do that. So what Wendy has done in this book is she has picked 150 stitch patterns, and she has the written instructions for flat and in the round. She also has them charted, and you can see if there's a difference between flat or in the round. She'll have a different chart, and you can see where those extra stitches are supposed to be. Most of the patterns will look the same, whether they are knit bottom up or top down. So you can use them for a bottom up sweater or a top down sweater, or even the way I sometimes or oftentimes will knit, where I'll knit the body bottom up, but the sleeves top down. And so you will know that those stitch patterns can be looked at from any direction. There are a few patterns in here where the directions are different for knitting bottom up than top down. She's already done that conversion for you. So there are a lot of stitch patterns in here, and she's done all of that work for you. So if you're the kind of knitter who you can't be bothered to chart something or to convert it, or you don't know how, or it's just more work than you're willing to do, a book like this could be really useful for you and your knitting. The past, I don't know how many years, 5, 6, 7 years, we have traveled to Santa Fe for Thanksgiving to visit my mother-in-law, and I always do the cooking. I've been doing Thanksgiving dinner since I was 13 years old. We, of course, didn't go last year, and so we all missed Thanksgiving, and the year before that, we didn't get together for Thanksgiving. We got together between Christmas and New Year instead. So it's been 3 years. Yeah, 3 years since we've all been together for Thanksgiving. My husband and I drove down there, my brother-in-law, sister-in-law, double masked and flew out from LA. My kids were both there. My daughter, Nina, who lives in Amsterdam, she and her boyfriend, Sam, are still in the country, so they were staying down there. And in addition, my mother-in-law's brother moved to Santa Fe about 5 years ago as well. So when we have gotten together for these holidays, we've gotten to see them. They had never really lived near family in their entire adult lives. And of course, they're retired. They're about 80 years old now. My mother-in-law and her brother Arlin are living very close to each other, and they see each other just about every week, and it's been really lovely for them. One of the things about my office, and you can usually see some things in my office, like I have these two little bowls here that our family used to go to, like these paint your plate ceramics places. My husband painted this one, and one of my kids painted that one. And so I like having these kinds of things in my office that members of my family have made. I obviously have things that I've made in this office, but I like having those kinds of things. I also have some ceramics that usually you can see when I'm doing Technique Tuesday and I'm standing up, but I have the ceramic that my daughter made when she was in high school of big shells with little sea turtles that are hatching out of it, so I have that she's made. The thing that we got when we were in Santa Fe this year is this bird right here, and this is a long-billed curlew that Uncle Arlin made last year. So he has this whole workbench in his garage. It is so tidy, like there's not a single bit of sawdust or anything anywhere. He's so tidy. But every time we visited in the past few years, we'd come to his house and there would be more and more of these birds. And there would also be, he would find interesting sticks that were weirdly shaped, and he would paint them to be snakes. So all over their house, they have all of these amazing birds, and some of them are real birds, and then some of them are what he calls fantasy birds. And what he explained to us is that he usually has a plan to create a real bird, and then something goes wrong and it's not coming out right, and so he creates a fantasy bird. And I'll put some pictures of some of these birds. So they're amazing. And what he did this year was Hanukkah is going on right now. So my husband's family celebrates Hanukkah. So we were doing Hanukkah and Thanksgiving all at the same time. But Uncle Arlin had us come over to his house, and he put 2 birds on the table, and he said to me and my husband, pick whichever one you want. And we're like, oh, really? And so, you know, we picked a bird, and then my brother-in-law and his family went over the next day, and I assumed they got to pick a bird as well. He had given snakes to all of the grandnieces and nephews on Thanksgiving. He went around with a box and had them all pick a snake that he had made, but then the adults got to pick out a bird. So I just love this. So I think I'm going to keep it here in my office unless my husband objects and wants it on display in the living room or something. But I'm just going to add this to my collection of things that family members have made. I have knitting tools that my brother has made me. He's a woodworker. He's made me a nose to pinna for hand winding a center pull ball. And recently he made me 2, what are they called? They're like wooden spatulas, but I can't remember. Spurtle. They made these spurtles that I use for blocking a strand of color work that I love. So I love being in this office surrounded by things that family members have made. So the past couple of weeks, I have done a couple of technique videos on sock toe that I'm calling the spiral sock toe. Some people call it the star toe, some call it the round toe. I already had videos for different toes, one called the star toe and one called the round toe on my channel. And so just to keep those separate when referring to them, I call them the spiral toe. And it's So I've done a video on the cuff down version and the toe up. And I mentioned last week that I was knitting these socks for my daughter's friend who also joined us for Thanksgiving. And I had used that toe, I knit this toe up. I had used that spiral toe, and I was thinking that the toe could also be used for a heel because short row toes and short row heels are knit exactly the same way. A peasant heel, the standard peasant heel, is knit exactly the same as a wedge toe. And so as I was knitting this, I thought, you know, this could probably be used as a heel. But I assumed that the process would be very much like converting a short row heel or a wedge toe into a sock heel in terms of any modifications that might be needed due to fit issues. Like I have a very long heel diagonal, so I usually have to modify. So I did a couple of experiments. In the first one, I used my previous knowledge of how I knit peasant heels to calculate the number of stitches that I would need. And I knit this little sock swatch. So it's just like an inch or so of sock leg. And then I did the heel, and then I knit a little bit of sock toe. And I tried it on, or sock foot. And I tried it on. I'm like, no, this is way too tight. And so I thought about, you know, what was different about the way that this toe was constructed compared to, you know, these other kinds of toes and heels. And I came up with a way to enlarge it. And I wasn't really sure if it was going to work. So I knit a second one, and that one worked perfectly. So now I knew how to use this toe as a heel for my own foot. The next step was to figure out, well, how do I do this for other feet? And so I wanted to make one for Nicole. So I used sort of the same process of figuring it out, like what would work for her, but I really didn't know if it would. And so I had only knit the foot when we went down for Thanksgiving. I had her try it on, and I was like, oh, I hope this fits. I don't know if it's going to fit. And it seemed to be okay, but I didn't know how it was going to fit once I knit the leg. I didn't know if that would improve things or change things in some way. And so I knit the leg like the next day, and I had her try it on, and it fit her perfectly. So I'm like, okay, so I know how to make it fit for me. I know how to make it fit for her. But as it turns out, sort of the stitch counts are exactly the same for her as they are for me, even though the rest of our foot and legs don't fit the same. So I still wasn't sure that I had the formula locked down. So I asked last week who might be interested in testing out this heel to see if my idea is right, because I don't want to make a technique video or write a tutorial for it and publish it if I don't have it right. And so I need to test it on a couple of other feet. And I invited people to leave comments down in the video description if they wanted to participate, and a lot of people did. And what I learned for the comments oftentimes informs me of what I failed to communicate when I made that remark. So some people say, well, I'm not that new a knitter, I'm not that experienced, or I've only knit a couple pairs of socks. So let me explain a little bit about, and some people said, I would love to test your sock pattern. And so what I would need to make clear is I'm not writing an entire sock pattern for you to follow. What I want to do is test this technique. Now you could knit a sock and incorporate that into it. But if you're interested in just learning more about the heel or wanting to help with the experiment, you could just knit a little swatch like this and try it on and see how it works. And so that is really what I'm looking for. I will explain how to measure, what to measure, how to approach it, but it will require, at this point anyway, you to do a little bit of arithmetic, and certainly could help you with that as well. I think what I'm probably going to do is create a thread in my Ravelry group and give some instructions in there for what to do. I haven't completely solidified my plan. I've got a few things coming up this week and next week before I can really commit to focusing on it. But I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not writing a full pattern for a sock from start to end. This is, we are testing the heel. So if you are accustomed to incorporating or swapping out heels and you want to put it into a sock heel and see if it fits, that would be great. Or if you just want to do a swatch size thing where you could test it out. So, and it could work in either direction. And actually, because this toe can be knit in either direction, you could actually start here and make the spiral toe as if it were toe up, and then work in one direction for the leg and then in the other direction for the foot. That's possible too. So this is, I just wanted to clarify more what it is I'm looking for and what you can expect from me and what I'm looking for from anyone who wants to participate. I'm not going to say you can't do it or you can't do it. You need to self-evaluate and see if this is something you're up to. You can drop out at any time. It's just trying to get a sample size that's large enough to make sure that my idea is going to work, and also when it doesn't work, to try to figure out, well, how can it be adjusted to work for some situations where somebody might have some more unusual fit issues. Because my goal is always for a sock knitter to be able to choose whatever kind of heel that they want, regardless of how their foot is proportioned or shaped, and that we don't relegate certain heels for certain foot shapes, but that anybody can make any kind of heel, but they might need to make modifications for it. Our road trip for Thanksgiving, it was a 10-day road trip. So, and it takes us 2 days to drive each way. So I knew I was going to have a lot of time to knit in the car when it was daylight hours. We're getting to those short days of the year. So there were some parameters that I had to be able to keep track of. And I wanted things that I wouldn't have to think too hard about when I was in the car. I wouldn't have to try to consult a chart. I wouldn't have to, just refer to, I just needed to be able to knit. And so one of the things that I was knitting was this scarf for Nina's boyfriend, Sam. He basically just wants a regular size length scarf that is joined at the end, so it's one big loop. He's calling it a snood. Some people would call it just a circular scarf. Some people might call it an infinity scarf. I tend to call it an infinity scarf if there's a half twist in it, but maybe that's just me. I don't know. There's a lot of different names for this kind of thing. So I was knitting his scarf for a while and I got a little tired of it. I needed a break. So I started working on a balaclava for my daughter Nina. I almost got it done. But when I was in the car, the circular needle that I was using to create the ribbing around the neck, the cable snapped. And it didn't snap at the joins. Let me show you what it looks like. So I don't know if you can even see, maybe if I put this in front of my shirt here. So it was a 32-inch circular needle and the cable just snapped. This is, I think, the first interchangeable set I ever had. I bought it in 2005. It was Knit Picks. And I bought them because I was tired of buying needles of all different sizes. Every time I had a project, oh, I have a size 7 needle, oh, but it's not long enough, or it's too long, or whatever. It was just getting very annoying to me. And I was in one of my very first knitting groups. I was actually able to talk to other knitters, and somebody said, oh, you should get one of those. Knit Picks has these interchangeable sets. And I thought, oh, that sounds neat. And so I went and I bought them, and I bought a couple of tips and cables just to try them out, and I liked them just fine. So I bought the whole set, and I've had it for more than 15 years. And one of the things that I always liked about them at the beginning in particular was that the cables were very flexible. Back in 2005, there weren't very many circular needle companies that had cables that were really flexible. A lot of them were quite stiff. Addy had good cables, but they were kind of expensive, and when you had to buy one every single time, they were a little bit expensive because they were imported, and at that time there was only the Addy Turbo, at least that I could find, which had a much shorter, blunter tip, and I did not like that. So what I liked at the time about the Knit Picks is they had the qualities that an Addy had that I liked, but they also had pointier, longer tips. So I really loved those. So the very first project that I wanted to knit after I got this new set of needles was a hat that called for a 16-inch needle, which I couldn't make with my interchangeable set because at the time, interchangeable needles tips were always 5 inches in length. And the combined length of the two tips cannot be greater than 50% of the total circumference of the needle. So if you have a 16-inch needle, half of that is 8 inches. You can't have two 5-inch tips that add up to 10 inches for a 16-inch needle because you just aren't left with enough cable to actually allow yourself to knit in the rounds. So even when you do have it split 50-50, you end up with something that's more like a teardrop. So that was a frustration, and the person in my knitting group said, well, why don't you just use magic loop? And I was like, I don't know what that is. So I looked it up, and as soon as I found out about magic loop and eventually traveling loop and other things, I realized I didn't need a bunch of circular needles that had different lengths of cables. I could use a 32-inch circular needle for everything, and I pretty much do. Occasionally I knit a blanket or something where I'm doing like a border and it needs to be on longer cables, and so I have this interchangeable set and I can put the really long cables with the extenders on them if I need to. But 99.9% of the time, I can knit whatever I need to with a 32-inch circular. And what was so great about the knit picks was that the cable was flexible enough to do that. So they were inexpensive, had so much utility, and I really liked them. I just didn't need them to be interchangeable. And so over time, I found fixed length circulars brands that I really liked, like Signature Needle Arts came out with fixed length circular needles, and I absolutely adore those. Those are expensive, but I love them. There's always my first choice. And now they don't sell fixed length circulars. Their interchangeables are a set of tips, and you can choose the length. That's true for a lot of interchangeable companies now. You can choose to get 4-inch tips, and then you can make whatever size circular you like. I wouldn't have wanted that even if that had been available because I don't even like a 4-inch tip. It's too short for my knitting style. I like a 5-inch tip, but you can even get 6-inch tips from Signature. And what they do is you buy a set of tips and you get 2 cables that go with it. Those cables don't work with other tips. So it's a very different sort of model of creating interchangeable needles. But I have the fixed length circulars. I've had them for many, many years. I love them. I haven't needed to replace them. One of the things I noticed a couple of years ago, though, because I started buying ChowGoo needles, if I needed an extra fixed length circular, I started buying ChowGoo. I really like their cables. And I started to think, well, geez, my Knit Picks cables seem like they're a little stiffer. Are they stiffer, or do they just seem stiffer in comparison to what is available now, where these seemed really flexible compared to what was available back when I got them? And I wasn't sure, but I think on this trip when this snapped, I think the plastic had gotten a little stiff and brittle, and that's why it snapped in half. I still have the tips. I could still use them if I wanted to with another cable, but I do prefer, for the most part, to have fixed length needles if I can. So I was not quite done with that hat on our way home, and I had to get home and then find another size 6 needle because I don't keep a lot of extra needles because I only use a 32-inch most of the time. I just don't have that many needles. I did find one, and I'm getting to where I'm almost done with this balaclava. I will have it done next week. It's called the November balaclava. It's kind of, she describes it as a more feminine opening so that you see your hair. It's not like a tunnel in the front. It's so you can see your hair, but it covers your ears. And it's done in fisherman's rib, which is a type of brioche, something I don't do a lot of, but I do occasionally. And I'm using 2 yarns held together. The pattern calls for 2 yarns held together. It calls for like a worsted weight yarn plus like a mohair silk blend to give it that kind of halo to it. And my daughter had seen a yarn that she really liked that had like a white or a light colored core through it, but it was just too thin of a yarn weight, and I didn't want to go through the process of converting the pattern to something that could use that yarn weight, and wanted to use a thicker yarn anyway because it's a hat. We looked at what kinds of mohairs they had that would give her a similar effect as the yarn that she really liked. The yarn, the dark blue yarn, is Madeline Tosh DK, which is a superwash 100% merino. The mohair we chose, it's either called Ito or ITO. It's all caps ITO. Sensai. Ito or ITO is Sensai. It's a 60% mohair, 40% silk. So we looked at, silver mohair, light blue mohair, white mohair, and she decided that she liked this. So it kind of gives it a marled look to it. So I'm just finishing up. I'm actually using a tubular bind off at the bottom to get the ribbing off the needles. And then I'll have to pick up around here and knit about an inch of Knit One Pro One ribbing, and then bind that off as well. And then it'll be done. So I'll have something to show you guys next week. But this is a nice little pattern. I liked it. It's a top-down construction. You start with a little square of fisherman's rib at the top. And so when you have like a little square, then you pick up along 3 sides, and then you're going back and forth in fisherman's rib with that pattern. Get down to the ears. There's a couple of increases done so that it comes a little bit more forward over the ears. And when you reach the chin, you cast on stitches to join the 2 edges and then knit regular ribbing in the round. So it's a clever hat, and I really like it. And I'll leave links down below to the pattern and the yarn that I'm using and things like that. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.